Today we're taking a look at the various groups that make up Judaism in the New Testament, particularly the Gospels. And this is a really important topic to understand because it'll help you better understand the conversations that Jesus is having. When you read the Gospels, one of the things that sometimes you can feel is that Jesus is in a way saying random things, wandering through the Galilean hillsides with these sort of philosophical sayings, or sometimes the conversations he enters into can seem like very strange conversations. But when you begin to understand the various groups that made up Judaism in the first century world, you begin to realize that Jesus is having conversations that make a lot of sense to those various groups. And the other temptation we face is we have a tendency to think of the Jews in the time of Jesus, right? You'll hear this kind of the Jews were against Jesus, or Jesus spoke against Judaism, particularly imagining the Pharisees. But the reality is the Jewish landscape of the first century was far more complicated than what you could really summarize in one group of people. And that's what I want us to take a look at. What are these groups that make up Judaism, the sects of Judaism in the first century? So we'll be looking at that in the time of Jesus specifically. And perhaps a good place for us to begin that conversation is just to imagine the complexity of the situations in our own world. I mean, if I said, what is an American today? Can you speak broadly of Americans as one group? Well, certainly you can. There is an American culture. But on the screen, I've tried to just break up some of the ways you could think about Americans. So on the left is a map of the different cultural regions. I think we all understand that the culture of Georgia is very different than the culture of New York. The culture of Southern California is very different than the culture of Idaho or Wyoming. And the people that live there have different views, different values. I've also got a pie chart that shows the various religious breakdowns. I mean, even to speak of American Christianity, well, do we mean Catholics? Do we mean Orthodox? Do we mean evangelicals? Then let's subdivide evangelicals down. Do we mean Pentecostals? Or do we mean Southern Baptist? Or do we mean Methodist? I mean, within these terms we use broadly are a lot of differences of opinions. And you could imagine entering into conversations, very different conversations. Or the bottom one is obviously the political spectrum. People imagine themselves politically to the left or to the right or in some sort of moderate position. And if you enter into conversations with people, you can bet one of the things you're going to end up talking about are those political views. Now, in Jesus' day, many of these things were combined. Their religious views had political implications, and where they lived geographically often impacted those religious and those political views. And so as Jesus is moving from Galilee to Samaria to Judea, as he's interacting with different kinds of people, both Gentiles and Jews, he's encountering people that have different perspectives, both religiously, politically, geographically, and that plays out in the conversations that Jesus is having. It's again why understanding these various groups helps you better understand what Jesus is saying in the conversations he's having. So we're going to look at a few of those groups, although there's plenty more. You could talk, in fact, probably most Jews living in Galilee in the first century are probably what scholars, even ancient sources, refer to as the Eretz, that is the people of the land. So these are the common people who are probably, do they have political views? Yes. Do they have strong religious views? Absolutely. But most of their days are spent surviving. It's in agriculture and work, and they probably don't belong to a strict sect, although they may lean or identify with one of them. On the left, I've also got a long list of just various groups that are mentioned in either ancient sources or within the New Testament. So we have a group that are known as the followers of John that actually show up later on in the book of Acts. They see themselves as disciples of John. Of course, there are the followers of Jesus. There are groups like the Zealots, or perhaps even the more aggressive Sicarii. There are the Samaritans. There are the Herodians who support Herod and his dynasty. There are the Bethusians, which seem to be a priestly group, perhaps related to the Sadducees. Within Phariseeism, we'll see this later on, there are subdivisions of those who follow teachers like Hillel and those who follow teachers of Shammai. The point is, hopefully by the time we get done with today's presentation, instead of understanding all of the Jewish groups, you'll actually recognize how complicated and complex the world was. But in many ways, I think that's what makes the gospel so honest as well. It reflects the kind of real-world complexity that we know in our own life as well. You could imagine if you dropped somebody from 2,000 years ago into today's world and tried to explain all the various groups and views and opinions, it could be overwhelming. We shouldn't imagine that going back 2,000 years suddenly makes everything very simple and easily categorized. The truth is, it was as complicated then as it probably is today as well. Now, we're going to focus on three groups. I may throw in a few comments at the end about some others. But we're going to look specifically at the Sadducees, we're going to look at the Pharisees, and we're going to look at the Essenes. Of course, the Sadducees and Pharisees are specifically mentioned in the Gospels. The Essenes are not, but I think you'll see as we get to them why I think they're an important part of this conversation as well. One of our really important sources, in fact, I'm going to keep coming back each time we come to a new group, is the first century historian Josephus. If you've watched my other videos, if you're following along in the Luke series, I quote from Josephus a lot because Josephus is an eyewitness to many of the things happening in the first century. So he understands these groups very well. Josephus was actually a military leader in Galilee during the Great Revolt that led to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And he ended up defecting over to the Roman side and spent his life mostly in Rome after that, documenting and writing the Jewish history, primarily for a Roman audience. But he gives a pretty complete history of the Jews, as well as describes many of these Jewish groups, and it's those pieces where he gets into the descriptions that we're going to look at specifically. So as an example, here's one of the things Josephus writes in the Antiquities book. The Jews, for a great while, had three sects of philosophy peculiar to themselves: the sect of the Essenes, the sect of the Sadducees, and the third sort of opinions was that of those called Pharisees, of which sects, although I have already spoken in the second book of the Jewish Wars, yet I will, for a little, touch upon them now. So Josephus goes on to describe each of these groups, and we'll use that as sort of anchors for our own discussion, see how he's describing them in the first century. Then we'll also look at how these groups show up in the Bible, in the New Testament, in conversation with Jesus, and there's a lot we can piece together to help us make sense of those conversations. The first group we're looking at is the Sadducees. The Sadducees is probably a derivative of the name Zaddokim, or the Zadokites, which was, if you remember, Zadok being the first priest in the first temple. These are descendants of those prominent old priestly families. And the Sadducees, even in the time of Jesus in the first century, are still associated with those prominent leadership positions around the temple. And that's going to become for them kind of the defining mark, although it will frame a lot of their other beliefs and positions as well. So if you remember how the temple, the priesthood, the flow of priesthood began to break down during the Seleucid kingdom, the intertestamental period. If you haven't seen it, I've got a whole video that walks through that history, all the leaders of the intertestamental time. And during that Greek rule under the Seleucids, they began, well, at one point they stopped worship within the temple. And then when worship was happening, they tended to start appointing high priests. That becomes even more common later on under the Romans and the Herodians, where at times they're actually bidding out the job of high priest. Well, if you remember what the priesthood was supposed to be, it was supposed to be passed on from father to son all the way back to Aaron. And so as these things begin to deteriorate, what are these important families who are tracking their lineage, who are supposed to be serving in these positions? What do they do when that whole system begins to break down around them? So that's going to be an important question, not just for the Sadducees, but the Sadducees at the first century had basically, they had made peace with Rome. They had attempted through their connections, through that sort of political maneuvering to maintain positions of power. And for large part, the Sadducees are a relatively small group in the New Testament. They're really just focused within Jerusalem, and they're primarily made up just of those wealthy priestly families who, although they may not be in complete control, are continuing to try to negotiate, at times bid or regain, to control the temple itself. And so that's going to become an important group as Jesus arrives in Jerusalem. Here's what Josephus has to say specifically about the Sadducees. But the doctrine of the Sadducees is this: that souls die with the body. We're going to break each of these down, so he's going to list a few of these, so just keep track of them in your head. Souls die with the body, nor do they regard the observation of anything besides what the law enjoins them. For they think it an instance of virtue to dispute with those teachers of philosophy whom they frequent. But this doctrine is received but by a few. So very few people actually agree with the Sadducees, yet by those still of the greatest dignity. So it tends to be the wealthiest or the most prominent who hold the views of the Sadducees. But they are able to do almost nothing of themselves, for when they become magistrates, as they are unwillingly and by force sometimes obliged to do, they addict themselves to the notions of the Pharisees, because the multitudes would not otherwise bear them. There's a lot going on there. I want to work through each of those, but he's basically describing a small group of people who often will align themselves with the Pharisees, even though they have disagreements, because the Pharisees tend to be more supported by the people. We'll dig into that more when we get specifically to the Pharisees. But to summarize some of the main points that Josephus is describing, we could summarize the Sadducees this way. They are the smallest group we'll look at. As I mentioned, they're probably just, these primary wealthy families in Jerusalem who describe themselves or imagine themselves as Sadducees. They're also the wealthiest of the groups we'll look at because of their relationship to the temple, because of their positions of leadership around the temple. They will find themselves amassing, and partly because of the prominence of their families, that generational wealth. They're the wealthiest of all the groups. As I mentioned, they controlled the temple, so they will be the ones who are primarily functioning as the leaders of the temple as well as the sacrificial system. And they are probably the majority of the Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin being that Jewish ruling body that was functioning within the temple in the first century. Although, as Josephus points out, they're often pressured to align themselves with the Pharisees because the Pharisees are supported by the people and have more support by the masses. And so although they hold these unique positions, they may at times tend to align themselves differently because of their limited number. We also know from Josephus, as well as the New Testament, a little bit about the beliefs of the Sadducees. So, number one, and Josephus points this out, they only support the reading and the keeping of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, what is often called the law. What that means is the Sadducees did not read the prophets, the historical books. They may have believed in the history, but they didn't believe those books actually were a part of the practice of the Jewish faith. The only thing they believed was that they had to support and live by the law that had been given to Moses. That has a few implications, which I have on other points here. So they are not in support of the oral, whether it's recorded or oral traditions. That'll be really important when we get to the Pharisees in a moment. But the Sadducees did not try to work out all of the requirements of the law in the complexity that the Pharisees will. They basically take the first 5 books, they apply those books directly, and that's the extent of the Jewish obligation. Because of that, they do not believe in the resurrection or the afterlife. Josephus mentions that, and we're going to see that actually comes up in the New Testament as well. Now, how could that be? Why do they not believe in resurrection? Well, if you read just the first 5 books, later Jewish writers and Jewish thinkers will find evidence for the resurrection in those first 5 books, but it's not explicit. It's certainly not as explicit as they are later on in the prophetic books. So the Sadducees looked at just the Torah, just the first 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And they said, we do not see any description of an afterlife, any description of resurrection in their first 5 books. Therefore, we reject that the resurrection or an afterlife exists. That was the official position of the Sadducees. They also did not believe in angels or demons. Now, in the first century, the idea of angels became really, demons as well, became a kind of hot topic. So there were people, particularly the Essenes we'll get to, but others who had very complex ideas around the structures of angels, the spiritual powers at work. The Sadducees, again, because they did not see that evidence in the first 5 books, rejected the idea altogether. Josephus also tells us that they hold a position about the sovereignty of God of free will, that each of us are basically required to make our own choices. And you see how that system sort of works as a philosophy. There's no afterlife, there's no resurrection. God has given these exact laws to his people. As long as they keep those laws by their own free will, it'll go well with them. And if they don't, then destruction will come. That's basically the extent of it. So the Sadducees see their responsibility as keep the Mosaic law, keep the sacrifices, the temple as God had described it going. And this becomes the sort of focus of the Sadducees. To summarize that a bit before we look at a couple passages from Scripture, and this may be somewhat surprising, the Sadducees are actually considered to be the more conservative party in Judaism in the first century. And that language is sometimes hard. I don't love using the sort of liberal conservative language because you'll start reading American politics into it. So be careful for a second. What I mean by saying that they're the conservative party is that they did not believe in new innovations, new ideas, new oral traditions. They had fixed the line with the giving of the law to Moses, and there were to be sort of no changes to the Judaism beyond that. They held this very strict, limited view. Whereas the Pharisees are going to constantly be having debates about how to interpret the law and drawing new traditions based on the law. The Sadducees will play no part in that. So they actually are really a more conservative group. They're really interested in the preservation of the temple, the power they have associated with it, and they're also wealthy, which will become a factor for them as well in the opulence of their homes within Jerusalem, and also their motivation to stay in good graces with Rome, which protects that power, protects that wealth. Let's read a couple passages. So this one is from Mark chapter 12, and we get to see the Sadducees showing up in the scriptures themselves. So from Mark chapter 12, "And Sadducees came to him," this is Jesus, "who say that there is no resurrection." So we just talked about that. Here it is actually in the Bible. Josephus backs this up from the first century as well. "And they ask him a question, saying, 'Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies,'" so before I keep reading, what are they making their appeal to? Exactly what we would expect. The Sadducees are appealing to Moses, what is written in the law. That is their scripture. "Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but leaves no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother." They're talking about the right of levirate marriage. So if your brother dies and is left no heir to carry on his name, your responsibility is to marry his wife, produce a child, and that child will be treated as the descendant of his deceased father. Now, so they give him, verse 20, this imaginary situation. "There were 7 brothers. The first took a wife, and when he died, left no offspring. And the second took her and died, leaving no offspring. And the third likewise. And the 7 left no offspring. Last of all, the woman also died. In the resurrection," they ask, "when they rise again, whose wife will she be? For the 7 had had her as a wife." Now, when you read this for the first time, you think, this is an absurd question, right? Is this going to happen? A wife marries 7 brothers. Each one dies and produces no offspring. Couple things. These are the kinds of theoretical debates that, as we'll see with the Pharisees in particular, they loved these kinds of debates. How do we work the implications of the law out to its furthest possibility so we understand the full reach of the law? But number 2, once you understand the Sadducees' position, then you understand the kind of absurdity of what they're doing with Jesus here. They don't believe in the resurrection at all. They don't believe in this question. It's not even a legitimate question for them. They too think the question is absurd. But since Jesus believes in the resurrection, they're trying to trap Jesus with an absurd question. They set up these 2 laws, the law of the rights of the deceased brother to have his wife remarried, and they set it against Jesus' view of resurrection to try to make resurrection sound ridiculous or to make it sound implausible. And you see in Jesus' answer, Jesus said to them, "Is this not the reason you are wrong, because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God?" In other words, Jesus comes right back at them and says, you're so limited in your understanding of the scriptures, particularly because you're so limited to just this strict reading of only the Torah, that you don't really understand God, you don't understand the trajectory of God, the work of God, and he goes on to explain more. But I want you to see what Josephus writes about in the first century aligns exactly with what the conversation Jesus is having with Sadducees in the first century. We get this really clear picture. One more example of it from Acts chapter 4. "As they were speaking to the people, the priests and the captains of the temple and the Sadducees came upon them." So here we have the Sadducees associated with the leaders and within the temple. "Greatly annoyed because they were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection from the dead." Well, what is it that would frustrate the Sadducees? Not only their rejection of Jesus, but now people are saying that Jesus has been resurrected, which again, we know that the Sadducees did not support resurrection. So I hope you're getting a sense of how, once you begin to understand a little bit about these various groups, it really helps you understand the conversations Jesus is having with them. Now, let's look at another one. So this is the group of the Pharisees, perhaps the most widely known of all the New Testament groups. And we want to explore what is it the Pharisees believed. And again, look at how Jesus interacts with the Pharisees and see if the understanding we have of the group helps us better understand those conversations. A little bit of a lengthy passage. This is Josephus again. So just like we did with the Sadducees, we'll let him guide us in this first description of the Pharisees. So Josephus writes this. "Now, for the Pharisees, they live meanly and despise delicacies in diet. They follow the contract of reason." So he's already describing them in a kind of position separate to that of the Sadducees. So the Pharisees are not wealthy, but instead they're living in a kind of frugal way. And they think they ought earnestly to strive to observe reason's dictates for practice. They also pay a respect to such as are in years, nor are they so bold as to contradict them in anything which they have introduced. And when they determine that all things are done by fate, so by opposed to the free will of the Sadducees, they have this different position, which he's now getting into. They do not take away the freedom from men of acting as they think fit. So they hold this kind of combined position of men are responsible for action, although they believe in a kind of sovereignty of God. Since their notion is that it hath pleased God to make a temperament whereby that he wills, what he wills is done, but so that the will of man can act virtuously or viciously. They also believe that souls have an immortal vigor in them, so there's a kind of eternity to the soul that they're describing in opposition to the Sadducees, and that under the earth there will be rewards or punishments according as they have lived virtuously or viciously in this life. And the latter are to be detained in an everlasting prison, but that the former shall have power to revive and live again, like a resurrection. On account of which doctrines they are able greatly to persuade the body of the people, and whatsoever they do about divine worship, prayers, and sacrifices, they perform them according to their direction, insomuch that the cities give great attestation to them on account of their entire virtuous conduct, both in the actions of their lives and in their discourses also. So already you get a very clear distinction between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. In many ways, Josephus is intentionally drawing out those differences. The Sadducees, wealthy, limited in number, primarily around the temple, very strict in their observation. The Pharisees tend to be more interested in debates, understanding the full law. They also tend to be very virtuous in their character. They're not wealthy people. We're going to see they're more grassroots amongst the people. And because of that, they're largely supported amongst the general population. The people tend to defer to the practice of the Pharisees. And because of that, they have quite a bit of power just because the people support them. Let's do a little bit of summarizing for what Josephus says. Number one, as we mentioned, they are popular with the people. So as Jesus is amongst the crowds, as he's amongst the cities and villages, it's no surprise that he runs into the Pharisees. They're more middle class and laymen. So the Pharisees are not, they're not coming to their positions based on tracking their lineage to important priestly family lines. Instead, they're earning their reputation amongst the people by their own virtue, by their own practice of their faith. They also tend to be scattered or centered around the towns and synagogues. So while the Sadducees are focused in Jerusalem around the temple, these Pharisees are teaching and leading and working in synagogues all over the region. And they do hold positions of power because of their support of the people. We do know that there were Pharisees who served on the Sanhedrin, on that ruling council, and probably had an increased amount of influence because of the support of the people. But they are a minority within that ruling class within Jerusalem. Let's summarize a little bit of their beliefs, because Josephus gets into those, and we know quite a bit from the New Testament as well. Of course, number one, compared to the Sadducees, who only believed in the Torah, the first 5 books, the Pharisees had the full Hebrew Bible. So they are interested in the prophets, the writings, the histories. They treat those as scripture. They're using them to help interpret the law as well. And one of the main points which we're going to unpack is they had a rich oral tradition. It was not enough to simply read the law. The Pharisees were really interested in expanding that law, as we're going to see, in such a way that it would protect the core of the law. So their oral traditions were not attempting to create new laws, but their oral traditions were meant to explain, to understand, and protect the keeping of the law. That's an important distinction we'll look at in a moment. They also believed in resurrection and an afterlife. They had a structure of the angelic and demonic, and they had a kind of combined position between human choice and divine knowledge, so that both God was sovereign, but also men bore responsibility for their choices. You can see they're more interested in action and the accountability of that action than the Sanhedrin were. I want to talk about the oral tradition because this one becomes really important. So I'm quoting here from what's called the Mishnah. I've done that quite a bit in our Luke series as well as some of the other lectures. The Mishnah was in the 200s AD. It was a writing down of the collected oral tradition that came before it. So while it represents a written date later than the New Testament and than Jesus and the Gospels, it actually tracks conversations, debates, and oral teaching that even claim to go back to the time of Jesus or before. So when we read the Mishnah, we have to be careful. It's not a document from the first century, but it is a document that writes down tradition that had been building since the first century. So it does help us better understand what's happening in the first century world, particularly around the Pharisees, that eventually will sort of, after the fall of Jerusalem, will become, or at least be identified with the rabbinic sources that are putting together books like the Mishnah. So let's read this section. I think it'll help us better understand the idea of oral tradition. So the Mishnah writes, Moses received the Torah from Sinai. And so this is the end for the Sadducees, right? It's from Moses, and we just have to keep the laws of Moses. But you'll see what the Pharisees do with it instead. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and committed it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. The men of the Great Assembly is that founding of the kind of rabbinic Judaism. So you see now the idea is not just we look at the law and keep it, but the law and the keeping of the law, the tradition of the law has been passed from generation to generation. And they said three things. So these various groups across history have now commanded the people who are keeping the law to do it according to these three principles, three things. Number one, be deliberate in judgment. Number two, raise up many disciples. And number three, make a fence around the Torah. I think it's worth talking about each one of those items for a moment. Number one, be deliberate in judgment. This idea is you should debate, you should think, study, wrestle, gather together the wise, and determine how the law should be kept in your day. This is that idea of deliberate in judgment. And so one of the things that will become really important to the Pharisees, we'll see this in the New Testament, is debates about how the law should be applied to any given situation. Even when the law was given in Moses, and now the Jews were in the first century, there's a significant period of history between those two. So you could imagine when we read the law, we ask questions about, well, how do you do this in the 21st century? What does it mean now in the time we live in to carry this out? Particularly, you think of the Jews in the first century, there's not a tabernacle anymore. So how does this now apply to the temple, right? We're not wandering through the wilderness like some of these stories. So what does it mean now under Roman opposition? So what the Mishnah is suggesting is it should be important and it should be a priority that they think hard, debate, study, and be deliberate in defining and judging how the law should be kept. Number two, they should raise up many disciples. They should pass this information on. It shouldn't be kept within a small group of people like the Sadducees who control that power. But the Pharisees believed that this oral tradition was to be taught to all the people, so all of the people could keep the law. That'll be important, we'll see in a moment as well. And then perhaps of these three, the most clarifying for us is, and make a fence around the Torah. Many times when people read the things the Pharisees will say in the New Testament, the Pharisees get a bad rap for being legalistic, is sometimes the way we imagine them. We imagine that they just love making rules, and they love forcing people to keep these rules. And Jesus is going to confront that. But to really understand those conversations, you need to understand their motivation. And here in the Mishnah, we get it described as building a fence around the law. If it is critical that they don't violate the law, they keep the commandments of the law, which they were meticulous in counting those commandments, describing those commandments, then the Pharisees had the idea that instead of allowing people to get right up to the edge of that line, right up against breaking it, if they could create a set of traditions and rules that clearly defined the scope of the law, then they could protect people getting close to actually breaking the law. So in other words, let's set up some traditions that a person unknowingly or because of a lack of education or just by mistake, they might break the law. But if we set up rules and traditions around the law, we can fence it in and keep people from getting close to violating the law. I've got some good examples of that we can look at, and I think it'll help you better understand, because this comes up often in conversations with Jesus. In the first one, let's talk about hand washing as just an example, because again, we could do this with several other topics. But this is from Mark chapter 7. Now, when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of the disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. You notice here it is in parentheses. Mark gives us this parenthetical note. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. So what does he say here? Not keeping to the law, but keeping to the tradition of the elders. We need to explore that. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" The reason I like this as an example is, do you remember the example I gave of the Sadducees? The Sadducees came saying, Moses told us in the law. That's exactly how they would have thought, right? What is the strict interpretation of just the Mosaic law? But what is it here that the Pharisees come with? Their question is, why do your disciples not keep the traditions of the elders? That is, the oral traditions, like we talked about in the Mishnah, meant to protect the law. What are they talking about when they talk about the traditions? Well, let's go back for just a little bit. And I think what we can do here is unpack a Pharisaic way of thinking about these laws. They didn't just make up a tradition to wash their hands. It was connected to the Old Testament. So here are the two passages that have to do with hand washing. So the first is from Exodus 30. The Lord said to Moses, "You shall also make a basin of bronze with its stand of bronze for washing." He's describing here in Exodus 30 the construction of the tabernacle as well as all of the instruments, the furniture that are a part of it. "You shall put it between the tent of meeting and the altar, and you shall put water in it, with which Aaron and his sons, so the priests, shall wash their hands and their feet. When they go into the tent of meeting, or when they come near the altar to minister, to burn a food offering to the Lord, they shall wash with water, so that they may not die. They shall wash their hands and their feet, so that they may not die. It shall be a statute forever to them, even to him and to his offspring throughout their generations." So what do we get in the first reading? There is a legal requirement in the Torah, the law of Moses, to wash your hands. But it's specifically in the tabernacle, the priests are to wash their hands before going into the tent of meeting or before these sacrifices. Now, we get something else in Leviticus chapter 15. This is basically the extent of hand washing in the law. Leviticus chapter 15. "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when any man has an unusual bodily discharge, such a discharge is unclean, whether it continues flowing from his body or is blocked, it will make him unclean." So now we're in a situation where there is a kind of medical situation. "This is how this discharge will bring about uncleanness." Then he gives instructions. Anyone the man with the discharge touches, without rinsing his hands with water, must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. So if you have one of these unclean bodily discharges, you have to wash your hands before you can touch another person or their clothes, or else you risk contaminating them with this uncleanness. Now, this is the extent of hand washing laws in the Old Testament. So how do we go from the priests should wash their hands, and in these particular medical situations of uncleanness, you should wash your hands, to now we have Jesus being confronted by the Pharisees because his disciples eat a regular common meal without washing their hands? Well, you get a sense of it. They believed that if they could create laws to help protect the core law from being broken, they could build a fence around the Torah and strengthen the law. So they began to build up traditions, not only about everyone washing their hands, but even how those hands should be washed. Let me give you an example again from the Mishnah. So this is how the Mishnah instructs people to wash their hands. And we'll see in a moment, they've now extended it beyond the priesthood to everyone. I'm going to read pretty quickly through this because I'm making a broader point. You don't have to understand or memorize every line of it. I think you'll understand when we get to the end. But from the Mishnah on hand washing, these are the instructions now of the oral tradition. "Hands become unclean and are made clean as far as the joint." How so? "If he pours the first water over the hands as far as the joint, and pours the second water over the hands beyond the joint, and the latter flows back to the hands are clean. If he pours the first and the second water over the hands beyond the joint, and they flow back to the hands remain unclean. If he pours the first water over one of his hands, and then changes his mind and pours the second water over both his hands, they are unclean. If he poured the first water," okay, I think you get the point. Maybe I don't have to read the whole thing. There are very clear instructions being given about the order in which hands are to be washed, about where and how water is to be poured in what order. I've actually got a photo here on this slide. This is from Jerusalem, the wall that Jews still go to pray to today. And before they do, they will often wash their hands, and there are these fountains outside for it. You'll even notice in the image there are some special mugs that have two handles. There are still these traditions amongst the Orthodox on exactly not only hands should be washed, but how to wash those hands. So again, I want to ask the question, how do we go from two Old Testament laws to now this mass complex tradition about hand washing that is being applied to Jesus and his disciples in the first century? This is from a commentary that was written on the Mishnah, and it actually answers or seeks to answer this very question. So how did we go from these simple laws to now these complex oral traditions? And this is a modern commentator who's writing about the Mishnah, and this is what they write. The rabbis require us to wash, taking up of hands is the term, for two reasons. To be in good habit for offerings, when the laws of ritual purity, so now they're going to explain this, how do we stay in good habit for the offerings? When the laws of ritual purity were relevant for the priests, the Kohanim, that's what we just read about from Exodus, how they were to wash their hands before they ate. Since we're not always aware what our hands touched, and maybe they touched something impure, and then they'll make the food impure. We want the Kohanim, the priests, to stay in this habit, even though nowadays they're all impure, and therefore they don't eat offerings. There is no temple today, so anybody who could track themselves into the priestly families are unclean simply because the mechanisms of cleanliness through the temple no longer exist. But so that when the Bayit Mikdash, the holy house, is rebuilt, someday if the temple is rebuilt, speedily in our days, they'll keep the offerings they eat pure. So in other words, he's saying we should be washing our hands so that one day, so that we're in the habit of it, so that one day when the temple is rebuilt, we will be able to continue washing our hands. He explains that those who are not Kohanim priests must wash before they eat bread to reinforce the priests in this habit. Now, this is a really important Pharisaic idea, right? And I think this commentator is getting the Mishnah's intent correct. The Pharisees had the idea that if it is critical that the priests are clean in their hands before making offerings or eating those offering meals, how can we protect and make sure that always happens? Well, what if we made everybody who is a Jew wash their hands before they ate? We would be reinforcing the habit and making it easier for the priests to keep that tradition and to not violate it. And then he gives a second one, for cleanliness and holiness. The rabbis found a hint to this in the verse, make yourselves holy and be holy. So in other words, they said, of course the priests are to be holy, but if God also says that we are to be holy, then perhaps as much as possible, we should all, as common people, be living like the priests. So you get a sense here of how the Pharisees are they don't just love rules, right? They're not just obsessed legalists who are always trying to find new rules to make up. Their motivation for doing this is, how can all of the people live as if they were a priesthood, so as to protect the law and to ensure a proper, holy, and clean priesthood? Let me give you one other example of this that I think is often confusing, but once you understand these conversations, starts to make sense. Mark chapter 7, so it's just after Jesus is having this conversation about hand washing and their traditions. And he said to them, so this is Jesus speaking to the Pharisees, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and mother. He's making an appeal to very clear Mosaic law, 10 commandments. And whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, so now he's comparing what the Pharisees are doing, if a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is korban, that is given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition, that you have handed down, and many such things you do. Now, you read this the first time, and it's very unclear what is going on here. Let me try to explain it to you, and then I think you'll see how it fits into the Pharisees. The idea he's describing is somebody apparently says to their father or mother, who presumably they're frustrated with, everything that I would have helped you or given to you in old age, all of the support that was going to you, is now korban. It's now dedicated to God instead. This could have happened in a moment of frustration, but it may have also been happening as the Pharisees, remember, they mark themselves by being the most faithful, the most spiritual, right? At other places, Jesus is going to talk about the phylacteries they wear on their head, how they make them larger than others, and how they walk around with sunken-in faces to show their days of fasting, and they want their tithing and their prayers to be seen in public. It may have been also that they were taking these massive pledges of saying, all of my wealth from this point on is dedicated to God. And because of that, they could then say to their needy mother or father, I'm sorry, I can't help you because I've dedicated everything to God. And the Pharisees believed that once that commitment was made, once you had sworn those things to God, then you couldn't go back on that swear. You had to keep your word on that. And so Jesus points out that this tradition that they've built up this dedicated gifts, or their public displays of it, or holding to these promises, these oaths they made, are now keeping them from keeping the actual law, which was to honor their father and mother. Let me give you one more example, and hopefully you'll recognize this scene. So if you've ever seen this scene, this is the no soup for you. I was reading a commentator, and he actually alluded to this scene, saying that this is a still kind of tradition. The owner of the restaurant making soup was Iranian in the TV show, and there still is this idea that he was actually based on a true character from New York who was Iranian. And there are places in the Middle East where there's still this sort of saying, forbidden for you, right? And he's speaking this. And once he's spoken it, there's no going back on it. This is probably what's happened with this statement of Korban in the first century. In other words, somebody's able to declare something Korban, and it may have even been no longer really a religious thing. It may have just become a way of saying, that's mine and you're not getting any of it. But the tradition of keeping that thing, Korban, dedicated to God, has become so prominent that it's actually keeping people locked into these oaths and then violating the law of helping others like their parents. So the Mishnah, again, this seems like such a random thing for Jesus to bring up. But when you read the Mishnah, which records, remember, the debates all the way back to the first century, it actually shows that Jews were debating this very question in the time of Jesus. So when Jesus brings this up, he's not bringing up some random thing. He's actually bringing up what would have been a debate even amongst Pharisees on how to handle these situations. So from the Mishnah, we read a very similar thing to what Jesus just set up. A man spots a crowd of people eating figs from his trees. So he's upset. People seem to be taking figs. He shouts, Korban to you, right? No soup for you. It's forbidden for you. What if his father and brother are in the crowd? So the hypothetical question is, if he has just cursed and forbidden anybody from eating from the tree, right? This idea, it's dedicated to God, probably in the first century, having become this kind of curse. Korban to you, it's forbidden from you. And if that's now an oath he has to keep, what if he didn't realize it, but his father and brother were in the crowd? Has he now restricted them from ever being able to eat figs that his tree produces as well? Seems like a strange hypothetical, but remember, this is what the Pharisees like to do. How do we understand all of the possible implications of the law? So then the Mishnah gives us a couple of rulings. How would two different teachers answer this question? The disciples of Shammai ruled, everyone is prohibited from eating the fig tree except his family. So in other words, Shammai would say there are certain laws like honoring your father and mother that supersede even this dedication you just made. But the disciples of Hillel ruled, no, everyone is permitted to eat the figs. In other words, Hillel says the motivation of the curse itself is invalid. Therefore, he can't forbid the people from it. It's interesting. They actually align more with Jesus than the Pharisees Jesus seems to be encountering in Mark chapter 7. But the broader point I want you to see is Jesus isn't just bringing up what seems like strange and unusual things to us. You know, who does this? Who dedicates something and then curses their family and refuses to help? Well, this was a common Pharisaical debate that was taking place in the time of Jesus. And largely what Jesus is doing is weighing in on that very debate. Now, we can draw a few conclusions. Again, I like in that last passage I read from Mark 7, it says, and they did many other things like this. We've just looked at a couple of them. This became the kind of way of thinking for the Pharisee. So what do we see of the Pharisees? This constant debating and discussing about how the law should be applied fits exactly with the Bible. They tended to be more scholarly and oral focused, keeping the tradition, passing on the tradition, teaching that tradition. And they were also popular with the people because of it. I mentioned that the Sadducees were kind of a conservative position. They only believed in the law. They would always come back to the law, and there were no additions to it. By that definition, again, I'm not using American political language, but the Pharisees were actually the more liberal position because they were constantly trying to apply the law in new ways. And they were interested in sort of discussing and debating if they had been applying that law correctly and even making corrections over time where it would be applied. They were really interested in how the law continued to be applied. So you see a lot of innovations, new ideas, new ways of worshiping, new ways of keeping the law that emerge out of the Pharisaic tradition. I do, before we move on to our last group, I want to ask one question, because Jesus is so often in conversation with the Pharisees. Are the Pharisees Jesus's enemies, his primary opponents? I actually think the Pharisees get somewhat of a bad rap in our preaching. If you read the Bible carefully, you'll find that there are actually a lot of people who are Pharisees who are commended by Jesus. I mean, Paul himself will not only say that he was a Pharisee, he will describe himself even after converting to Christianity as a Pharisee. So I think what we have going on, Jesus is so often in conflict with the Pharisees, probably for a couple of reasons. Number one, he's around them so much because they are within these Galilean towns and villages. But number two, I have this idea on the screen, the rule of minimal differences. This is the idea that we tend to have the strongest debates with the people we are closest in thought or opinion to. This probably works itself out in people you know, workplaces you know. Of course, if people are on very different divides from one another, of course there's hostility, of course there's differences of opinion. But to be honest, those people generally don't find themselves in conversation with one another, right? If you have such vast differences of opinion, you tend to avoid each other, or you assume you know what that person thinks, and therefore it's easy to sort of write them off. Now, where you have the strongest conflict, and I think this is true if you think about within denominations. I mean, some of the fiercest fights are within the same church, right? Where some of the fiercest fights are fights within a denomination where we share so much in common, but it highlights these particular areas of difference. I think that's a little bit of what's going on with Jesus and the Pharisees. Jesus actually, in many ways, agrees with the Pharisees on several points. He does believe in resurrection. He does believe in the whole Hebrew Bible as law. He does believe in an active living out of your faith. He is like them for teaching all of the people. This isn't just about positions of wealth or power for him. So in many ways, Jesus is very much a part of the sort of milieu of the Pharisaic world. But because of that, he in particular will see, and often it will come to a head, those particular differences between himself and the Pharisees. But again, to make the point, just because I'm trying to keep you from always making the Pharisees the bad guys, consider Acts 23. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee." He's a Christian giving defense, but he's describing himself as a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. "I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." He just takes that Pharisaic position and pushes it right into the middle of his defense. Or Acts 26. "They have known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing, that I conform to the strictest sect of our religion, living as a Pharisee." I mean, Paul is not going to run away from the fact that he sees the world, that he identifies himself as a Pharisee. So, yes, lots that Jesus needs to correct with the Pharisees, lots that can go wrong with the Pharisaic view of the world. But at the end of the day, Jesus is in these conversations probably because he's around this position most, and certainly we can't just say being a Pharisee makes someone wrong or evil, because Paul will identify himself with the movement, although obviously there will be distinctions he will have within it. Before we get to the Essenes, I just wanted to mention the scribes. The scribes come up many times in the Bibles, and they're often associated with the Pharisees. They're associated with the Sadducees. The scribes are probably what we would imagine as scholars today. They are legal experts. So they are those who have dedicated their entire lives to studying the law, to knowing, probably memorizing most of the Hebrew Bible. And they would have been available as a kind of resource in communities, or they seem to be primarily in Jerusalem. If there were questions, much like today, if we have questions, what do? We have attorneys, we have judges. If disputes really get serious, we call in legal experts to give opinions before judges. The scribes were these kinds of experts in the law who were helping answer questions, often asking very complex questions. And so they seem to be somewhat separate. Perhaps some of them were Sadducees, some of them were Pharisees, but we see them in various places and times working with both those groups. The next group I wanted to talk about was the Essenes. The Essenes are not mentioned specifically in the New Testament, but as we're going to look at them, they play an important role in the first century, and if for no other reason than they help us better understand the complexity of the Jewish faith in the first century, and I think you'll see why that's important. The Essenes are probably a group of priests who had completely broken off from the priesthood and the temple in Jerusalem because of its corruption. They were led originally by a teacher who they call the teacher of righteousness, who led them out of Jerusalem and into the wilderness. Now, there will be Essenes everywhere in other cities, or people who support or believe the things of the Essenes. But we know most about the Essenes because of their kind of their living away from power, away from cities, and primarily because of discoveries found at Qumran, like the Dead Sea Scrolls we'll look at in a moment. But they regarded Jerusalem, as well as the Jerusalem priesthood and temple, as being corrupt and illegitimate. And so they were, it seems by their own writings, trying to preserve a pure priesthood for one day when the true temple would be restored. And so they become this kind of withdrawn group of Jews in the midst of all of the other Jewish debates. A little bit of a long passage, but I want to read it from Josephus, as we've been doing. The doctrine of the Essenes is this, that all things are best ascribed to God. They teach the immortality of souls and esteem that the rewards of righteousness are to be earnestly striven for. So in other words, they're not interested in worldly things. You could characterize the Sadducees as interested in power and wealth in the temple, the Pharisees as works of righteousness primarily so that it can be taught and applied to other people. And the Essenes are going to be primarily interested in pure, strict forms of righteousness, even if that means withdrawing from the world. And when they send what they have dedicated to God into the temple, they do not offer sacrifices because they have more pure lustrations of their own. They've rejected all temple worship, on which account they are excluded from the common court of the temple, but offer their sacrifices themselves. Yet is their course of life better than that of other men, and they entirely addict themselves to husbandry. So in other words, they're raising their own animals, making their own sacrifices. They've just rejected the whole establishment. It also deserves our admiration, how much they exceed all other men that addict themselves to virtue, and this in righteousness, and indeed to such a degree that as it has never appeared among any other men, neither Greeks nor barbarians, not for a little time, so hath it endured a long while among them. This is quite a statement Josephus is making, that they are the most righteous and devout, they are the most faithful to live what they believe of any group of men who have ever existed. This is demonstrated by that institution of theirs, which will not suffer anything to hinder them from having all things in common, so that a rich man enjoys no more of his own wealth than he who hath nothing at all. There are about 4,000 men that live in this way, and neither marry wives nor are desirous to keep servants, as thinking the latter tempts men to be unjust, and the former gives the handle to domestic quarrels. But as they live by themselves, they minister one to another. So in other words, he's describing a kind of a monastic common life where they come and pool all of their resources and wealth. They live in complete harmony with one another, having all things in common with one another. And he says there's specifically around 4,000 of these men who have done that, even choosing celibacy as a way of practicing it. They also appoint certain stewards to receive the incomes of their revenues and of the fruits of the ground, such as are good men and priests, who are to get their corn and their food ready for them. They, none of them, differ from others of the Essenes in their way of living. So he's describing this really high level of virtue, high level of intentionality of practice, separate from the world, and this kind of pooling together, kind of communal living of all things. So to summarize that a little bit, they are probably priests or count themselves in the lineage of priests, but trying to protect and preserve that purity. They are known as being the most devout among the Jews, sharing in this common life together. They also have rejected the temple, and so because of it, they play no religious or political role within places like Jerusalem. Now, I mentioned the reason we know so much about them is because of the find of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We knew about the Essenes from writings. It's not just Josephus, but Philo will mention them as well too. But it was really the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s along the Dead Sea. I have the map. If you look at the top, you'll notice where it starts listing some of the caves, Cave 11, Cave 1, Cave 4, as well as Qumran. I've got pictures of some of the scrolls as well as some of those caves where they were found. These scrolls obviously included, from a biblical standpoint, like an unbelievable number of biblical texts dating back as much as 1,000 years older than any biblical text that we had at the time. So it was just an unbelievable discovery. And particularly those scrolls, their accuracy is one of the things that really stands out, the preserving of the tradition of recording the biblical texts. But it wasn't just biblical texts. There were also what are known as like their community standards, so the community rule. There were their own writings about the future. And so scholars learned a lot about this particular group of Jews, as well as the broader groups of Jews in the first century from the writings that were found there in Qumran. I mentioned Qumran and because that's how we've learned the most about the Essenes, but Josephus alludes to, as well as others, this wasn't the only place that Essenes lived, although it seems to have been a kind of, there are many theories about this. There were certainly a group that lived there permanently, so it may have been a kind of like a place where the most devout had settled together. It may have also been a kind of retreat center where Essenes may have come for certain practices and festivals as well. But we do know there were other Essenes living elsewhere, like Jerusalem. So we read from the historical record that there was actually a gate of the Essenes in Jerusalem. There were enough of them living in one particular place that they were given their own entrance and exit out of the city so as to protect the kind of devout purity that they were living by. And so one of those sources says that they are living together in large communities in several cities of Judea and in many villages. So whatever the Essene perspective was, it was obviously lived out in its most intense form in places like Qumran, but it seems to have also been lived out within these other cities as well. So to kind of look specifically at the Essenes' belief, as we've been doing, they had a very apocalyptic view. Part of the reason that the Essenes have withdrawn and they're attempting to live purely as priests is because they believed at any moment there would be the coming of the Lord. They really believed in, we could do I think at some point we'll do a whole lecture just on the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they believed in two coming messiahs, a kind of kingly messiah and a priestly messiah that would reestablish the temple and rule. And they imagined an apocalyptic battle that would take place between the sons of light, which they considered themselves to be, and the sons of darkness, primarily those sons of darkness being corrupted Jews in their opinion who had given in to the powers of the world. So they had a very apocalyptic view, and they saw their righteousness as preparing themselves to participate in that end that was coming. They have this extreme devotion to the law. They do believe in resurrections and specifically rewards for those who are devout in their keeping of the law. I mentioned earlier in our conversation, they had very complex views about angels and demons. They believed all things to be fated. So all things were predetermined by God to include those sons of light and those sons of darkness as well. Just to show you how these groups connect to each other. One of the things you often find in the Dead Sea Scrolls is you'll find the Essenes referring to their opponents as those who seek smooth things, those who seek smooth things. And it's actually a kind of pun that's describing the Pharisees. So I mentioned that the Pharisees could kind of be described as the more liberal position, right? They're using the tradition and their debates to determine how the law could be applied. The Essenes looked at the Pharisees and thought that they had become too lax in their keeping of the law. I know that's hard for us to believe because we associate the Pharisees with the most legalistic and strict. But to the Essenes, what the Pharisees were doing is they were using their own traditions to excuse themselves from actually keeping the law, which, to be fair, is kind of Jesus's point to them as well, too. Their traditions have become more important than keeping the law. And so the Essenes will refer to their opponents, the Pharisees, as being the seekers of smooth things, those who are basically seeking the easy way and using their traditions to help them pursue easier things. Obviously, withdrawing themselves to the wilderness, they've picked the harder path as well. But you see, these groups are in conflict and dialogue with each other in the first century. The other thing I think is important to understand is the idea of the Essenes having rejected the temple. When we talk about the Jews in the first century, and I hear this in preaching, I probably have done this in the past as well too, is it's very easy for us to just say, oh, the Jews worshipped at the temple, or the Jews had this view about the temple, or this is how sacrifice worked for the Jews. And what we miss is that there were large groups of Jews in the first century who were already beginning to reject the temple because of its corruption. And I bring this up to say, Jesus will wander into Jerusalem on that final week, and he will begin to say things like, in 3 days this temple will be torn down, right? And not a stone will be left upon a stone. He begins to predict the judgment of the temple. He drives out the money exchangers, calling it a house of robbers. We read that and think that had to have been so shocking for the first century world, where we imagine, right, all Jews have this reverence for the temple. But the truth is, in the first century, you already have groups of Jews beginning to separate and to describe themselves, and this is important, as the true temple. The Essenes saw themselves enacting the true sacrifices, preparing themselves to reestablish the true temple. And you get this in their writings in some ways that I think are important to the New Testament as well. So on the left, I have a couple of quotes from scrolls that were found within the caves at Qumran. So again, we'll do a whole lecture, but 4Q just refers to the fourth cave at Qumran. 174 was the fragment number. And so it reads, "He commanded that a sanctuary of men be built for himself in order to offer up to him like the smoke of incense the works of the law." Really interesting here. They believed that they were a sanctuary of men. They were a temple of men, no longer sending up smoke incense of an actual burnt offering, but instead their acts of righteousness, their keeping of the law being a kind of incense. Or from Cave 1, the Habakkuk Pesher, the condemned house is a city of vanity, Jerusalem. They're talking about the temple. They perform a service for vanity for the sake of its own glory. So you get them very clearly rejecting the temple sacrifices. The reason this is so interesting is it sounds like things that are also being said in the New Testament. So take 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? That's a revolutionary idea that we could be the temple of God, but it's actually an idea that the Essene community was already thinking about in that first century. Or Luke 21. Then, as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, "These things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another, that shall not be thrown down." So again, this coming prediction, as I mentioned, of the temple's destruction, just like already the Essenes are calling out the corruption. I like looking at those because, again, helps us understand the complexity of the Jewish faith in the first world. And the things Jesus are saying are not these sort of random things he's come up with. He's very much entering into the conversations and the reality, the historical reality we know from these other sources, like the Dead Sea Scrolls or Josephus. What Jesus is saying in the New Testament just slots right into that reality we get from history. All right, the next section, I'm going to go pretty quick through just a few other kind of groups that you could keep your eye on. One of the other ones that will often get mentioned are the Zealots. The Zealots throughout the New Testament Gospels, we hear mention of them. Josephus says about the Zealots, they agree in all other things with the Pharisaic notions, but they have an inviolable attachment to liberty and say that God is to be their only ruler and Lord. In other words, they hate being ruled by Romans, and although they hold the Pharisaic tradition, the Pharisees seem to have broadly said, the way that we will get rid of Rome is by everybody faithfully keeping the law. The Zealots said, we will faithfully keep the law, but while we're at it, let's drive out the Romans. So they become more driven towards political and even violent action as well. You could summarize the Zealots as, you remember the story from the Old Testament of Phineas, who comes and finds sin being committed in the camp, and he spears the two people in their tent? That kind of a violent action towards the keeping of God's laws becomes their model, right? This is the way that we will bring back righteousness to the land. We will oppose and drive out the Romans. So it very quickly becomes a political movement. The Zealots also seem to be as complex as all of the other complexity. There's no, leader of the Zealots, but instead there are lots of Zealots with different opinions, different theories. They seem to be loosely connected. At times they're warring with one another. By the time we get to the Great Revolt and that Jerusalem falls in 70 AD, the whole city of Jerusalem, before the Romans even lay siege to it, is already attacking in a kind of civil war between these groups. And then you have groups like the Sicarii, who seem to have been even the most extreme, who are primarily targeting what they believed to be corrupt Jews. They were really just attacking other Jews who had sided or aligned themselves with Rome. So the Zealots become a very complex group in the first century. But to give you a few other references, the two on the left are going to be examples of Zealots. So from Acts 5, after him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished after all, and all who followed him were scattered. So this is a particular kind of revolutionary figure, Judas the Galilean. Or we get another one mentioned in Acts 21. Are you not the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men, the assassins, out into the wilderness, the Sicarii? So here we get another kind of a zealot revolutionary who may have had very different ideas. Zealot becomes a kind of general term for those who seek opposition to Rome through violence. But we also have them appearing in the New Testament, specifically amongst Jesus' followers. So from Luke 6, Simon, who he named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So here we get one of Jesus's followers called specifically a zealot. He had been a kind of revolutionary figure, and yet Jesus calls him and he chooses to follow Jesus. Or from Mark 15, they are crucifying him between two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. This idea of robbers is probably more associated with criminal-like zealots. So these are the ones who are stirring up the crowds and becoming revolutionary. Again, it paints a picture of the kind of broader chaos that's taking place in the first century world. Now, all of these groups, I want to bring us to one final question, and then obviously you're welcome to drop some questions in the comments. But How are we to think about Jesus in the midst of all of this complexity? I've got a few ideas here for you. Number one, Jesus is sometimes imagined as being hostile to the Jews, or that Jesus is speaking against the Jews, or you'll hear comments like the Jews killed Jesus. And the reason it's hard to say something like that is it's hard to speak of any one Judaism in the first century. Perhaps we should be thinking of Judaisms. What is a Jew in the first century, right? You have Sadducees, you have Pharisees, you have Essenes, you have Zealots. We haven't even talked about just the general population or those who had aligned themselves with, even more so with Rome through the Herodian dynasty. Or what about Jews who lived outside of the land at the time too? I think we have to be really careful when we talk about Jews in the first century to recognize, again, it's like saying 21st century Americans, as if we were all the same, believed the same things, and acted the same way. The New Testament world and Judaism in the New Testament world is far more complex than you could reduce down to one group of people. The second thing is, I want you to see how Jesus' teaching fits into all of those questions and debates. If you can get this, it becomes really helpful in reading the New Testament Gospels, because when Jesus is in conversation or when he's bringing up examples, you begin to realize these aren't random at all, but these are specifically aimed at or directed to those questions that divided or sometimes split up various Jewish groups. Number three, Christian practices often emerge from these Jewish conversations. As we looked at with the Essenes, we also see that with the various groups of the Pharisees, the rabbinic traditions that were to come. Christianity becomes something very distinct in the midst of these groups, really a group itself within that Judaism. But the things that they're doing, baptism and others, they find their connections to those Jewish practices of the first century. So by understanding those groups and that history, we're better able to understand how the Christians were emerging and their unique position within those discussions. And number four, this question, what was Jesus? Jesus was something different from these groups. At the end of the day, I don't think you can say Jesus was a Pharisee. Certainly doesn't claim to be. You can't say Jesus is an Essene. Doesn't seem to be. But his followers often emerge from these various groups. And Jesus, by calling them, forms them into something new. At the end of the day, Jesus will describe his kingdom as not from this world, that he's bringing something beyond these groups, beyond our tendency to break into these various groups. And so to really understand what Jesus is offering in the Gospels, you have to understand these groups, but then you have to see the way that Jesus maneuvers between them, drawing people from these identities into this new identity of being one of his followers. So there's so much. I love studying this piece of history because it helps us better understand Jesus in his commonness to the time that he was in. He lived in an actual historical moment, but also the uniqueness of what Jesus is saying amongst these various groups. Now, we've gone through a lot. There's plenty more we could say for each of these, but if you have questions, I would love to be able to hear your questions. So you can just drop those in the comments section on YouTube. I'd love to be able, I've been interacting on some past videos over questions. So if you have those, put those in there, and I look forward to being able to answer those. And if you're not subscribed, maybe take a moment to subscribe, and I hope you're keeping up with the Luke series. I've got plenty more Luke videos to come, as well as some of these special lectures. So subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in one of those future videos.